Welcome back to Press Coverage. This is Theo Gremminger. We had Adam Levitan on yesterday. This is not going to be a daily show, but when you have a chance to book guys like Adam Levitan and my guest today, Sigmund Bloom, you want to get them on the schedule, Sig. So it's a big honor to have you on. I will say that I told you in the pre-show, you're a big influence on me in my podcasting style. I like your optimistic approach to fantasy football. I like the way you see things from different sides. I've said when I started this podcast, I wanted to have guests on who had sharp takes, actionable information, and I wanted guests that could help my listeners find edges, because I think it's getting harder and harder to identify edges in fantasy football in this massive information age. So welcome to the show. It's great having you on. How are you doing today?
Oh, great. This continues to be quite a thing to behold, the whole universe of fantasy football content creation and consumption. And it's always a joy for us to get to spend time together and try to keep this a positive space and a shelter or a break from maybe some of the things in our lives that aren't so positive.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And I will say On the Couch is awesome. Anybody who doesn't listen to Sig On the Couch, it's like appointment listening. I think at this point you've had pretty much everybody on the couch, and I think it's great the way you get people to open up and answer questions. And sometimes you get off topic. You talk about cool stuff. You talk about music. You talk about, all kinds of things. And I think it's very, very interesting. And it definitely is one that I highly recommend. What else are you guys putting out right now at Football Guys this time of year?
Yeah, the series that is about to start are when we get the combined wattage brain power of the whole staff, and we give our answers as of now. We check back in during the preseason of who we think is the most undervalued, overvalued players that are deep sleepers outside of the top 150, and it gives you a lot of different thoughts, even on the same player, some different angles or reasons how you end up at the conclusion this player is undervalued or overvalued. And I think at this time of year, you're just massaging your brain. You're just trying to be ready for that fire hose and what is significant, and sorting out, because the information edge is lost. Like you said, the edges, it's hard to find edges now. The information edge is lost in the sense that everybody has access to good information and lots of information, but it's the ability to discriminate between the information that actually matters or is actionable or helping us narrow down a range of outcomes or enhance the low end or high end of it to understand where we want to target players and whether we want to target players or offenses at all. And I think that these exercises are good at saying this is where we're at right now with expectations, but we're open to changing. Really, you should still have a very open mind as a fantasy football player right now.
Yeah, I think that's really, really a sharp point you made. I think that we get so kind of dogmatic in our takes. I think that people look at the previous season, people look at early ADP. You'll start to see a couple of sharp people, whether they're high stakes drafters or analysts that are on a particular player. And then it's like you've talked about this, Sig, kind of the hive mind creeping in. Mm-hmm. And I think it's even more amplified now because there's so much good information out there. How do you filter stuff out? Because I know you guys reference, so you've been doing this for a while. Mm-hmm. Is it certain trust of certain beat reporters? Sure. Or is it like, how do you filter out the good from the bad? Or is it a drum beats thing for you?
Yeah. Well, I think you hit on two important things. Consider the source. And I was just saying on my show this week that if everybody wants to get their foot in the door in some way. Here's a project for somebody out there. If you're listening and you want somebody to retweet or share what you're doing, just put together compile a database of who the beat writers are from various outlets and how long they've been covering certain teams, and maybe how long they've been covering the NFL, because that gives you more weight, especially for a team like one of the guys that comes to mind right away is Mike Reese, who's been covering the Patriots since I can remember. And it's a little sensitive when you're covering the Patriots because they're tighter than a lot of organizations, which sometimes Mike Reese will try to tell you something without really coming out and telling you. But the point is that you put more weight depending on the source, and you becoming familiar with their writing style, becoming familiar with what's significant, right? There's some beat writers that are just the facts, ma'am. So if they say, I think you should be really excited about this player, that makes more sense than somebody who is maybe a little more optimistic, trying to be a cheerleader. And we're seeing this now more and more in media markets where Cecil, my co-host Cecil Lammy, who covers the Broncos, I shouldn't even say this, right? But I think it applies to a lot of markets where it's an access game, and the more critical you are, maybe you get less access, or maybe someone taps you on the shoulder and says, "Hey, I couldn't help but notice that on your show yesterday you said this," and this has been happening for a long time. I think it just happens more frequently versus organizations that can take criticism, or organizations that welcome hard questions. So that's part of it. I think the drumbeat is crucial, though, because the drumbeat, and Cecil was the first one really to use that term, is when you start seeing multiple sources saying the same thing during training camp. If 3 or 4 different beat writers are all saying, "Wow, it looks like this player is going to have a much larger role," or "This player has so much more focus and is in better shape," or "This new offense is going to really emphasize this part of the playbook that was just forgotten in previous years." So I think these are the things that give you more actionable information. And the thing I want to say, just as a quick aside, because there's so much great work done. My man Adam Harstad at Football Guys does a lot of this work where we understand biases, our cognitive biases, and we understand how we aren't the best evaluators in our own brains of what's good, what's signal, and what's noise. It's okay to put weight on something because it confirms your priors. Sometimes you were right. And of course, the pieces of information that reinforce something that we already thought was going to happen or already thought was true are going to stand out more. But I think that it's okay to dig in even further with those views, because isn't fantasy football basically about coming up with your own portfolio of stances, putting them into action, and seeing what happens?
Yeah, I love that. And shout out to Cecil Lammy, because that's like in the common vernacular now. So he doesn't even get credit for the term anymore because everybody uses it.
Yeah.
And I'll say that Harstad is great. You're on the couch with him, was terrific, and he got me a little depressed with the Tony Pollard take. But other than that, like Adam, you're cool in every sense except for your Tony Pollard take. That one got me a little upset. But it opens up my mind as well when you hear a conflicting take on a player with a lot of steam. Anyway, Sig, we're going to talk about a lot of great stuff, but first I want to run an ad from our partners at the FFPC.
Hey, people always ask me, what's the World Series of Fantasy? Hey, people always ask me, what's the World Series of Fantasy? What's the Super Bowl of Fantasy? And it's easy. It's the FFPC. Their signature Players Championship has a $6 million prize pool, and their best ball leagues start in February. And they're the answer to so many questions. Hey, what's the best place to get a Dynasty Orphan? Well, you can adopt a Dynasty Orphan at the FFPC right now. There's more orphans at the FFPC than anywhere else on the internet. That's why we partner with them. So if you want to play fantasy football for low, medium, high stakes, you love Dynasty, you love best ball, you love seasonal leagues, all types of fantasy footballers need to go to the FFPC. And remember, use promo code Underworld. Promo code Underworld gets you $25 off your first team. Promo code Underworld, $25 off your first team, no matter what the format is, at the FFPC. Go get it.
Well, I believe we're still alive, and I think we'll have Theo back. But I think that while we're doing that, I'll just give us a little news update and talk about what's going on. I come from the school of the show must go on, and even though it's not my show, the show will indeed go on. I think the biggest things that everybody is thinking about right now, as I wait for Theo to come back, are the status of Dalvin Cook and DeAndre Hopkins. And it's been really interesting to watch how we're getting piece of information, and I think folks should always remember that when we get pieces of information, there's always some intent behind it. So it's somebody trying in some ways to manipulate the conversation. And in both Hopkins and Cook's the conversations about them in the football media sphere, it seems like they have not received the market that they expected. And because of that, there he is. I was just doing a little segment because the show must go on. It's not my show.
Had a technical difficulty there, and Sig like a pro keeps it going. Shout out to it. Sig and I were talking about internet issues. Okay, there's been some in New Orleans. There's also been some on Long Island with the weird weather. So apologize to everyone there. But Sig, I hope it was interesting conversation. I don't mean to cut you off.
No, it's really, Theo, I just was pointing out that the Dalvin Cook and DeAndre Hopkins situations continue to be open-ended. I think the one thing we can say for sure is that they aren't receiving the markets that they were hoping for. I don't know that we can really, we can handicap favorites because it seems like the most interested teams are New England in Hopkins and Miami in Dalvin Cook. But the fact that the players didn't want to take those offers immediately means they're not quite satisfied. I still think they should be the favorites, but I also think that what we really need to consider is if the market is receiving them like this, are they seen in the same light that we see them in fantasy football? And I think that probably you want to bet the under, you want to fade these guys because it doesn't seem like the NFL is sold that they're going to be difference makers.
Yeah, I think that for me, it's Dalvin Cook's a little different, but a number of the veterans that are just sitting out there might go the Devonta Freeman route where somebody gets hurt. You know, we never, plan for injuries, but they happen every single offseason, and somebody goes down and maybe that drives their value up. But Sig, this was on the show sheet. I've heard you talk about it. Is it time for running backs to get their own union?
Right. Yeah. Well, and this is what's important about this is it can inform our forecasting of players' usage because the word I want to keep using is exploitative. I'm going to try to use that 1,000 times in the next 2 months. Exploitative running back market. And in an exploitative running back market, when you have Tony Pollard, when you have Saquon Barkley on a franchise tag, when you have Nick Chubb on an expiring contract, you use them up. You don't worry about preserving them. They're not players on rookie contracts with 2 or 3 cost-controlled cheap years left. Even someone like Bijan Robinson, it might not be cheap, but still it's cost-controlled. So I do think that we need to take those things into account. And what it also means is we need to understand that the talent gap, part of what drives this is, as we see every year, the talent gap and the relationship between talent and production is not that direct. So the talent gap, what I mean by that is street free agent running backs are NFL quality, and there's a lot of them. And there's starting quality running backs, or at the very least, primary or very central members of a committee in free agency right now that are probably all going to have to sign for the league minimum or close to the league minimum with some incentives, small incentives. And then on the production, and this is part of what's driving this, right? We could do a whole show on this. Running backs don't matter. Well, running backs don't matter, or don't take a running back in the top 10. Well, to me, what that signifies is a running game creates value or production by its execution. And as long as there's somebody competent running the ball, then you're going to get 80% or more of the production. Not very much of the production is created by the player. And I think that's why teams partially aren't valuing running backs, other than just that they get so beat up and they don't have long shelf lives. And the second contract, they almost always experience a big drop off in effectiveness. So I think it gets into running back by committee. I think it gets into specialized roles for running back that we're seeing more often now. And it means that, again, as always, it's really important to get those early running back picks right.
Yeah, I think that you nailed it. And I think it's interesting because this year there's so few running backs going in the first round that we're seeing like, and I know you guys are doing the Football Guys competition over at NFFC. I know we played the ad for FFPC, but in like the high stakes, you're seeing 14, 15 of the first 24 picks being wide receivers. So it's kind of changing the running back dead zone and kind of how we view it, but it's still kind of there because of the true bell cows are kind of disappearing. Would you agree on that?
Yeah. And I just had Ian Harditz, he's a mensch. He's a wonderful person. I just had Ian Harditz on the couch this morning. And he pointed out something that was really eye-popping to me. And I think absolutely this applies in our high-stakes contests. And I'm just looking at the NFFC Football Guys Championship ADP data right now. And I think it applies here. So the line that Ian cited was the running back 6 this year is going off of the board at the 18th pick. In the last 4 years, it was the 7th or 8th pick. That's significant. And that should be causing you, if you're a fantasy football player and if you're listening to fantasy football content, watching it in June, you were serious. Or either that or you go out and touch some grass. This means something. And what it means is, like you said, it affects the running back dead zone. He came up with that in a reply to a question. I said, he had said running back dead zone doesn't exist this year. I said, well, tell me more. That's interesting. Tell me more. And I think because running backs are getting pushed down the board, it creates more opportunities in the 3rd round and the 4th round to get running backs that we feel better about than the running backs that are usually available there. And I think it absolutely affects your strategy and approach to the position. I think it's just foolish to say, well, I'm just going to approach drafts the same way when the running back landscape is different than any other year that I can remember.
Yeah, it's crazy how we have these set in stone, almost like commandments for fantasy football, and they just come crumbling down. I think it was wide receivers on new teams who are guys we want to fade. And then all of a sudden, Stephon Diggs and DeAndre Hopkins a couple years back just smash it. And then we talked about, for years it was don't take quarterback early. Now quarterback early drafting is back. And the dead zone is the dead zone. Now the dead zone is completely different. And even last year, we saw so many, big time hits out of that dead zone, like Josh Jacobs. So it's super interesting. I think that it's amazing. It keeps us on our toes in fantasy when we have to change our approach to the game. And I love it. One thing that I've been asking a number of analysts like yourself, and you're also very interested when you do your rankings, because you also have IDP in mind, like when you analyze your rookies. I love that. But you put a lot of thought, and Football Guys in general puts a lot of thoughts into your rankings. You do your top 300. I'm putting together a top 300 as well. It's a labor of love doing rankings. But if you could pick one particular player where you knew their final stats for the season, maybe the hardest player to analyze or the biggest range of outcomes, who would it be?
Right. And there's some good, there's a bunch of names that come to mind right away. I think Breece Hall is a good name here. I think that Michael Thomas, of course. Some people say, I'll tell you Michael Thomas's final stats. You don't need a crystal ball for that. Like you said, players with wide ranges of outcomes. But then I also like to think about not just how it's going to inform us about that player, but our strategy at the position. And I'm going to cheat and say 2 names, but I think they have similar outlooks and similarly can affect our approach to our drafts. I'm going to mention Kyle Pitts and Darren Waller, because I think that both of these players have within their range of outcomes tight end 2, and not just tight end 2, but a tight end 2 that can make you feel like you're not giving up a sizable advantage to the Travis Kelce team every week if you have to face them in the playoffs, and I think that you should go into your draft with at least a plan A. You don't have to stick with your plan A. You know what your plan B and C and D are, but I think it's very viable to say tight end is going to be Darren Waller. It's going to be maybe take them around earlier than ADP to make sure, but they're going around the same point in the draft. So depending on how you feel about them, it can be an either or situation. But they have this very wide range of outcomes. But I also think that something else Ian and I were talking about today, I think is good, is understanding the emotional state of that fantasy football hive mind, as you mentioned, can help you find those values. Because I think in the case of both Darren Waller and Kyle Pitts, I love looking at year-over-year ADP, and both of their ADPs are down significantly from last year. You might argue that Kyle Pitts' situation is a little better because Marcus Mariota is not his quarterback, although we have to make sure his knee is okay. Darren Waller, you might argue, is in a better situation because, well, we didn't know it at the time. Derek Carr didn't give his best. That was really weird.
That was a weird one.
That was weird that he said that. And not that he didn't, but that he admitted that he didn't. But now Darren Waller is really the number 1 receiver for the Giants. And that could be, especially in second year of Brian Dable's offense, that could be magnificent for fantasy. So I think those 2 players, if I could know the stats of one of them, I would be able to have clarity on what my strategy is going to be. Am I going to go with Travis Kelce? Am I going to go with one of these upside mid-round guys? Or am I just going to wait and be thrown to the wolves with the waiver wire and hope I get a touchdown?
Yeah, it's tight end. There's a lot of like defeatist mentality right now, I think, at the tight end position. And I think a lot of analysts are, don't even want to talk about it because it's hard to rank and hard to find those edges. But Waller is super interesting. I'm glad you brought him up because we think back to Stephon Diggs when he landed with Brian Dable in Buffalo. And obviously Diggs was, there was a little less concerns. The play had fallen off kind of like we saw with Waller. But when Dable gets a weapon and he's able to move him around the field and utilize him, I mean, I think great things can happen. And I think for the Giants to take that next step as an offense, Waller being a really big thing this year is the path for it, especially considering the weapons they have at wide receiver. So I love that one. I share your optimism with Kyle Pitts. It's a tilting year for Kyle Pitts managers, especially in Dynasty. But I think in redraft, he's corrected. He's very close to like the Kittle tier. He's further away from the Kelsey and Mark Andrews tier. So it's definitely helpful. And we've heard, a number of people have given me Anthony Richardson as an answer. Just your thoughts on Richardson and what you expect in year one.
Yeah, excitement, some football follies. I expect that what we will see when it's good is a player married to a system, a scheme, a mentality on offense that accentuates his strengths. And we saw what Shane Steichen did with Jalen Hurts. It took 2 years to really make this all come into focus. Although I would argue, at least at wide receiver, there's more there for Anthony Richardson than there was for Jalen Hurts in year one. And I think obviously there's more organizational confidence than there was. I mean, it seemed like the Eagles kind of backed into having Jalen Hurts as their starter in year two. Worked out pretty well. So I do think that Anthony Richardson, we should be open to an upside that we can't calculate, right? I love to just say this line. He's the best athlete in NFL history at quarterback. He's the best athlete in NFL history at quarterback. And he's, by all outward indications, in an organization that wants him, like what he has to offer, and a coach that is going to know how to work with him, a coach that's going to encourage throwing downfield, 11-on-11 football as a runner, and copious amounts of usage as a runner. So I think that we may see some games where Anthony Richardson has affirmatively a bad game, but still a good game. Look at Justin Fields last year. Justin Fields was a terrible passer last year. The Bears passing game was microscopic. And yet he was swaying fantasy leagues whenever he was healthy in the middle of the season. So I think we could absolutely see something like that. Keep in mind that he's playing indoors on a fast track. He's going to be facing defenses like Tennessee and Jacksonville and Houston. These aren't exactly murderers row defenses. That's 6 games out of his game. So I think that a quarterback, and just to put a bow on this and tie it into quarterback strategy in general, Theo, I'm doing these live streams with Tom and Mike over there. Tom and Greg at MFSC. And I don't think you can punish teams for waiting at quarterback this year. Anthony Richardson's part of that picture. So if I don't take a quarterback in the first 10 rounds, and I can still go with Anthony Richardson and then some safety quarterback like Dak Prescott or Jared Goff or someone like that, I'm feeling pretty good. Going toe-to-toe with those teams, taking Josh Allen in the second round or Jalen Hurts in the third round or Patrick Mahomes. So I do think that Anthony Richardson is part of a pretty rich landscape of options outside of the top 8 or so that have a pretty good chance of finishing within the top 8.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. And take an optimistic glass half full approach with Richardson. I like your idea of drafting another quarterback with him. I think that's the only way you can kind of do it in case there is, stumbling blocks out the gate or maybe a couple of bad defensive matchups you want to avoid. But he certainly has insulation for fantasy production with his rushing output. And I think that's super exciting because a lot of times we bet on these guys. And if they don't have that rushing output and they're not quite in that elite tier, then it's hard to get those big boom weeks to really help you win. And I want to kind of stay with that glass half full, glass half empty wording because you use it often. I think it's a fantastic term. Some people refer to it as range of outcomes. What are some players and teams that have a wide range of outcomes and you see as possibly players that could tilt leagues? And I also want to get your opinion on Chris Olave here because you're seeing his ADP steam up in those NFFC drafts. He's also steaming up in the FFPC drafts. I think there's a lot of glass half full with him right now.
Yeah. I mean, I'll take Olave first since you ended with him. I think that he's probably being drafted close to his ceiling. And that's just the second-year receivers. I think that the range of outcomes for Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, Drake London, maybe not Traylon Burks. Jahan Dotson's interesting. We could come back to Jahan Dotson. Let's just take that big three. London. So you have London 2 rounds after Olave and Wilson. Is it just because we like Derek Carr and Aaron Rodgers that much more than Desmond Ridder? Maybe. I don't know. But I think that with any of these players, you could see a big step forward in year 2 and a big burst in production. Now, with Olave, we already mentioned this with Derek Carr saying, I didn't really give my best, or I forget how he worded it. But what I read, Theo, was that he himself was aware maybe he was in a funk. I mean, would Aaron Rodgers say this about the Packers? I don't know. His last few years with the Packers, where he just wasn't, he wasn't his giving his all. It wasn't because he was hurt or something like that. Yeah, Chris Olave is going to be the number 1 receiver, and he's going to take a step forward from last year. And a lot of the underlying metrics, efficiency, and things like that show that he's good. I mean, he better be good. They gave up 2 first-round picks to get him. But I'm more interested, if you want to talk about the Saints. I mean, there's always Michael Thomas, and is that the old banana in the tailpipe? You're going to fall for it again. But maybe, I mean, at least last year when he did play his 3 games, he was productive. He was the primary target. So obviously, if you're taking Chris Olave anywhere near ADP, then you don't believe in Michael Thomas. Then you think Michael Thomas, because a healthy Michael Thomas is anathema to Chris Olave hitting in the top end of his range of outcomes. So let's talk about Rashid Shaheed. That's the guy I want to talk about, because he's really cheap. I think Shaheed's numbers, Theo, was like 28 for 488 and like 2 or 3 touchdowns. I remember the touchdowns on 34 targets. On 34 targets. Now, I'm not saying the efficiency is going to remain the same, but I think Derek Carr is as good or better of a downfield passer as Andy Dalton, right? So if we get Rashid Shaheed up to 80 targets, 90 targets, we're talking about maybe 1,000-yard season of a guy that you can get in the 13th, 14th, 15th round. And in best ball leagues, because of his profile as a deep ball target, like I want to create some buzz around Rashid Shaheed. And I think that if you say Chris Olave's ADP makes sense, that means you're implying that Michael Thomas is going to be mostly a non-factor, which means Rashid Shaheed also is a player who we should be more optimistic about his projections than we are right now. And certainly he's a player I think that belongs in your draft plan.
No, I love that. And I think that's super sharp, Sig. And everybody write that one down, because you're the first person that's talked up Rashid Shaheed on any of my podcasts recently, Sig. And I love hearing it. Shout out to Weber State. You gave us Damian Lillard, and now Rashid Shaheed.
Harold the Show Arsenault back in the day.
Yes, beat North Carolina in the NCAA tournament.
From New Orleans, actually.
That's a great. Well, with the last name Arsenault, I mean, you don't get much more New Orleans than that. So yeah. That's pretty good. Very, very French. I want to also pick your brain on Garrett Wilson. Garrett Wilson is steamed up even higher than Olave. I love Garrett Wilson, but Garrett Wilson right now is a de facto first-round pick. He's going at basically the 1-2 turn on Underdog. I think he's 13 overall, right there in FFPC, NFFC. He's steamed up. It's become a Garrett Wilson versus CeeDee Lamb, Amon-Ra St. Brown argument more so than a Garrett Wilson versus Jaylen Waddle, Devonta Smith argument.
Yeah, and I get it with Garrett Wilson. This is really hard, Theo. I'm not sure. So statistics can lie to us, or the hard part about interpreting statistics is understanding the why, because Garrett Wilson had a really good year for a rookie last year. And overall, when Zach Wilson wasn't playing, this was a very productive Jets passing game. So here's something I'll be looking for. Are the Jets the team that signs Dalvin Cook, right? That's going to be meaningful, because on one hand, you look at this passing game and how productive it was in an overall way when Zach Wilson was not the quarterback. And you think, well, geez, Aaron Rodgers is an upgrade from whoever that was out there, right? Joe Flacco, whoever. And that means, therefore, this passing game pie is going to get bigger. And if we're projecting year 1 to year 2 growth for Garrett Wilson, and he's a clear number 1, because let's face it, I know that Aaron Rodgers loves Alan Lazard and Randall Cobb, and they kind of like are a package deal, but that's not striking the fear in the hearts of defenses, right? Corey Davis, keeping him around $11 million to do the number 3 or 4 receiver. I don't know. We'll see. It's the Garrett Wilson show, I think, in the passing game. But this is a good news, bad news thing, right? Because the good news is the Jets offense gets the boost from whatever quarterback they had to a happy Aaron Rodgers. By all outward indications, we have a happy, engaged Aaron Rodgers. On the other hand, package deal, remember, Nathaniel Hackett. I mean, we don't associate Nathaniel Hackett with overachieving offenses, right? We don't associate Nathaniel Hackett with efficient use of players.
And slow offenses, too.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Deliberate offenses. And look at what happened with the Broncos offense when he was out of the building and Justin Alton, who's now with the Titans, started calling plays. People that are wanting to hang their hat on a Russell Wilson rebound are looking at those last few games. Let's not overlook the play caller. This is why you mentioned CeeDee Lamb. And it's part of the reason why I hesitate outside of Tony Pollard. I hesitate on the Cowboys this year because Mike McCarthy is going to be the play caller. I mean, I don't know statistically how much we can say there's a correlation between play callers and the efficiency of offenses. So overall, I'm not even saying you're crazy if you take CeeDee Lamb over him. Amon-Ra St. Brown is safety. Amon-Ra St. Brown is, what you're getting. Maybe his target number is going to go down with all of the great pieces they've added, but perhaps his efficiency and production per target could go up. Perhaps the nature of his usage could include more high value targets now. So he's safety. He's attached to an offense where I know they have one of the best play callers and play designers in the league, right? And it's going to get better. So maybe it just comes down to attaching yourself to an ascendant offense. But if you really want to complicate things, I do think if you're drawing a draft slot near the 1-2 turn, you probably want to be looking running back at least one of those picks, which means you're probably not going to get Garrett Wilson.
Yeah, it's interesting that you're bringing up running back at the 1-2 turn. I want to come back to that. I first want to just talk about the second-year wide receivers because you mentioned Treylon Burks. There's a ton of, like, you talk about drum beats, you talk about, like, overall enthusiasm from everyone, from Mike Vrabel to the beat reporters to his fellow teammates. It seems like the Treylon Burks, the second-year breakout is coming for Treylon Burks, or at least they're going to try it.
Right.
When you look at the rest of those second-year wide receivers, you reference London, we reference Burks. You talk about Christian Watson. You talk about Jahan Dotson, George Pickens, Jameson Williams coming up. 6 weeks in, you'll have him. Where are we at, Sig? Which is the one that gives you the most pause you think could really hurt drafters who are trying to draft these second-year wide receivers and take the cheat code and the enthusiasm and the unknown upside?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, outside of Wilson and Olave, Wilson and Olave obviously have the most potential to hurt drafters because you're spending by far the most to get them. I think that there's a long way down with your second round pick. Other guys that I think Pickens gives me a little bit of pause. I think Pickens is definitely an eye of the beholder kind of player, where you can look at it in one way and say he can make plays that only he can make. And there was a Pickett to Pickens connection. He came alive a bit when Pickett got in there. And the Steelers offense should be closer to functional this year, not a top half of the league offense. So you don't need George Pickens to get that many targets in that offense if he is making those highlight reel catches. But a more detailed and comprehensive approach to evaluating his play shows that there are big holes in his game. He has a limited application as a player. And because of that, especially when you add in Allen Robinson, and I think this is going to be a conservative offense. I think that Kenny Pickett, the first commandment for him is don't lose the game. Don't lose the game. Okay. So I think George Pickens is one of those players that we can look at so many of these other receivers. Again, Dotson, London come to mind right away as players that I think not so much for fantasy football. Let's leave fantasy football aside for the moment and just say what we expected from them in year one. They did a lot more than we expected. How they won, how often they won. I mean, Theo, if we were doing some sort of conversion of like what 1 yard or one reception is worth in a passing game, how good was Drake London last year? My.
Unbelievable. And also Drake London, like we talk about, people worry about the passing volume in Atlanta. I mean, there's a lot to worry about but if we're betting purely on talent and profiles, few guys in the NFL have that real alpha mentality and alpha profile like we see with Drake London. So I think that taking an optimistic approach with him is the correct one. And if you miss, it's not going to hurt you so bad, because I don't think he's like, when he's on the field, even if the offense struggles, he's still going to have weeks that help you. I think it would be a consistency thing. But if he can somehow see the receiving volume that he saw to end last season with Ritter consistently throughout the year, then he'll definitely beat ADP. So I'm super interested in him. Want to stay on the theme of second year, because I've heard you mention second year offenses, and I think it's a great way of looking at things. Last year, we saw Detroit, Jacksonville, Minnesota, and the New York Giants all take steps forwards, become more functioning as offenses. Looking at these teams in like year two with either the head coach or the offensive coordinator, which of these four teams do you think could really take that next step?
Yeah, and they're all good candidates. It's Detroit. I just want to gush about Detroit. I just want to gush about Detroit's offense, because I think that you can see a clear trajectory here. Ben Johnson took over for Anthony Lynn late in 2021. And that's when Amon-Ra St. Brown took off. That's when Jared Goff started to play more efficiently. That's whenever this offense, we saw the embryo of the offense we saw last year. And you also, let's remember this team has a good offensive line, an offensive line that's probably going to be in place for a long time, which of course is the foundation of offensive success, along with the game plan, the scheme, the play design, the play sequencing. And we already saw some things last year that are unconventional by NFL terms, right? I keep citing this. I really need to go back and make sure this is true, but I'm only 97% sure of anything these days. That they had one stretch where they ran 5 consecutive running plays with 5 different concepts. And that's, teams usually have an identity, right? Even the great running games, the Kyle Shanahan and company running games, there's an identity. This is how we run the ball. And the Lions, Ben Johnson, really Deuce Staley, who's in Carolina now, saying, no, we have personnel, we have the capacity, the wherewithal to run the ball a lot of different ways and to really kind of scramble your mind and keep you off balance, not just physically, but mentally, whenever you're thinking about and anticipating what you're going to do with the snap. And then you have the idea of these mismatches. And I don't want to belabor this, but again, this team has a plan, okay? I don't care if you don't like what they did with their draft. They have a plan. And when you add in Jahmyr Gibbs, you mentioned Jameson Williams already for 11 games of the year, Sam Laporta, and I've cited a lot, Thor Nystrom saying, without Sam Laporta, Iowa would have had one of the worst Power 5 offenses in the last 25 years. Because this is one of the things about Drake London. There's something to be said for a player that still produces when a team knows that's all that the offense has. That's what was incredible about Drake London last year. That's all the passing game really had, because Marcus Mariota couldn't throw downfield to Kyle Pitts, and he still produced against number 1 corners, against teams that knew he was the main threat. Like you said, the alpha mentality. I think Sam Laporta did that at Iowa. And then Jahmyr Gibbs and what he can do as a receiver out of the backfield. And you already have an offense that was highly efficient and highly successful last year. And you're adding these mismatch nightmares. There's no defense that can match up with all these players. And then you have an offensive coordinator who's bold enough to dispatch and deploy all of these resources in a way to checkmate defenses, not to just incrementally have success, but to actually land knockout blows again and again and again. Dave Montgomery's better than Jamal Williams. Jahmyr Gibbs is better than DeAndre Swift, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How good can this offense be? I'm excited to see it. I think that you have to incorporate the lines into your draft plan in some way. And even if you don't like Jared Goff, what do we know about Jared Goff? He's good at being the kind of quarterback that is controlled by a joystick by the offensive coordinator or head coach on the sidelines. The play design is supposed to work like this. You just do that. He can do that.
Yeah.
So I think this is the offense. This could be the best offense in the league.
Yeah, I think that the Gibbs, you bring up Gibbs is super interesting, Sig, because he's going in a draft range right now where this is like the glass half full, glass half empty. Gibbs is going in a draft range around Najee Harris, around Travis Etienne, ahead of or near Ken Walker at this point. Gibbs, like people talk about the weight, you referenced David Montgomery. So there's a couple of hurdles here. There's talent in the backfield that has had fantasy success. But in terms of just pure pass catching ability, the amount of draft capital they spent on him, talk me out of taking Jahmyr Gibbs a lot, because I'm into it.
I'm not going to. And JJ Zacharyson, who's been magnificent, was on my show. And he was talking about the running back dead zone and said that one of the things that we need to keep in mind when looking at Gibbs is that running back dead zone is usually made up of running backs that we've seen get an opportunity. There's Najee Harrison to Travis Etienne, right? We've seen them get an opportunity. They didn't perform up to expectations, but they should get a similar opportunity. So while we're not drafting them that high because they aren't coming in with momentum, volume is king at running back, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's why they so often underperform, because we've already affirmatively seen that these guys aren't going to be overachievers, but we draft the volume anyway. He said rookie running backs in the dead zone, by his study, I don't want to put words in his mouth, and I think that it was perform roughly like a second round fantasy pick. And they're not in the dead zone because we've seen them and they've underperformed, but we still have to give a nod to their volume. They're in the dead zone because we just have skepticism about rookies. And I would add to that, I don't remember any time before, Theo, that a running back that went number 12 overall, not just number 12 overall, but number 12 overall in the peak of the exploitative running back market, the running backs don't matter market, is going in the fourth round of drafts. I mean, then back when I was starting my fantasy football, if you got picked in the top 12 of the draft, you might be a first round pick like Bijan Robinson is, who went number 8. The other thing about Jahmyr Gibbs that we have to remember is because he's a receiver out of the backfield, because he can make big plays, he doesn't need a lot of touches to hit. He does. Look at Alvin Kamara, Austin Eckler, et cetera. He doesn't, Christian McCaffrey, he doesn't need to get more than 8 carries a game if he's getting 4 or 5 receptions a game against stressed out defenses that are trying to have some slot corner or some linebacker or some safety match him.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I think that Gibbs also, like, if everything works out, I think breaking the rookie running back reception record is in the range of outcomes. I think you could see like Reggie Bush year 1 type receptions. And we talk about, like, you reference Kamara, you reference McCaffrey. Those guys hit as rookies. Like, they both beat their ADP. Kamara crushed it, and McCaffrey really beat it. And then they both finished inside of the RB1 line. So I'm with you on Gibbs. And I think that, yeah, the Lions told you exactly what they think about him. So I'm super into him this year. I'm glad to see you are too. Want to pivot over to the quarterback position. We've seen an incredible amount of steam in early redrafts like the FFPC and the NFFC, where the big 3 quarterbacks are getting pushed up. In the NFFC, it's even crazier, where you have the 6-point passing touchdowns. In the FFPC, both of those guys are gone, usually at the end of the 3rd round. NFFC, consider it the end of the 2nd, Sig, correct me if I'm wrong. Mm-hmm. So where are you at? Is the edge the big 3, or is the edge looking down and possibly embracing a Lamar Jackson, a Justin Herbert, or going even further down?
I think you need to be flexible. Whenever you draft this year, if you haven't gone out into the draft weeds yet, you're going to find that somewhere around the 3rd round, you're going to feel a significant drop off. Like when you feel your stomach, like when the floor drops out a little bit, there's going to be a drop off. And that's where it feels right to take a Jalen Hurts or a Patrick Mahomes in a 6-point pass touchdown league, or Josh Allen, because you know what you're getting. You know you're getting a guy who is going to finish in the top 5 of the position, at least for every week that he's healthy, right? Or projected in the top 5 of the position, and giving you in that Joe Bryant, wait, what's up, Joe, VBD way, a real valuable edge over the competition. However, as I said earlier, doing the exercise of a draft is going to show you that you're probably going to be pretty comfortable with the options at various points in the draft. So I think Lamar Jackson around a round and a half later than them, that is as attractive. I think Justin Fields 2.5 rounds later, as attractive. Anthony Richardson, we talked about. Even you can get in on Justin Herbert. Some of these quarterbacks that have a new offensive coordinator, right? Justin Herbert is interesting. Geno Smith is interesting. Jared Goff is interesting. Let's even say throw a last round pick at Trey Lance. There's uncertainty there. Who knows how that's going to shake out? There's a lot of different options. You might be into Dak Prescott. You might be into the Russell Wilson, Aaron Rodgers bounce back narrative. There's so many options that there's not a point in your draft where if you decide to break ties against quarterback, you're going to wish or you had taken a quarterback earlier on. So I think that for the same reason that JJ, I mentioned him again, pioneered that late round quarterback approach, the reason it felt good walking out of your draft using that approach was that you locked in advantages at other positions while other teams were taking quarterbacks early. So I think that just like so many other things, when the herd is moving in one direction, probably it's best to move in the other direction. So I think keeping that flexibility in your draft plan and waiting until you really like the value at quarterback, and it might be that at the end of the third round, based on the other names that are there, you might say, yeah, I'm going to take Jalen Hurts. That can be where that scale tips for you, but just know that the scale might tip even further for a value quarterback later in your draft.
Yeah, I love that answer. I think being flexible in your builds is very important. And I think that I'll give Dan Williamson of the GOAT District a hat tip for this one. He's probably going to listen to this, so I'll give you a hat tip, Dan. Dan, great NFFC and FFPC drafter. He likes to take quarterback when he feels like there's no other edge. So when the edge is gone, dive into that quarterback, and I think that's the best way to do it this year, whether you're early QB or late. And Sig, I want to press you on this one, because I think a lot of times when we're looking for the fantasy, the ADP crusher, it's often quarterbacks with rushing ability. Do you think, because I feel like the quarterbacks with rushing ability are getting pushed up, should we be identifying mispriced offenses and maybe diving into that, or are you still looking for, scrambling ability if you're going to go late at the QB spot?
I still think Daniel Jones is another name, right? Everybody right now, go look up Daniel Jones rushing stats last year. You're going to be surprised.
800, right? 800 yards?
800 range. Yeah. You're going to be surprised. And this offense is going to get better. Something that I'm leaning into as an edge, you already mentioned it, and I don't know if there's numbers to back it up, but I don't really care, because I think it's always developing. What we're looking at is it's like you never step in the same river twice, right? And second-year offenses. Really, I'm really fascinated with the idea that these offenses, you mentioned them already, the Giants, Minnesota, Jacksonville, that they can really take a larger step forward than we anticipate. Partially because Jacksonville's a good example of and the Giants too. Just the year one leap, Detroit too, was breathtaking and tilted fantasy leagues. It mattered, if you had some optimism about Daniel Jones, if you had optimism about Christian Kirk, if you had optimism about Amon-Ra St. Brown, you were rewarded in fantasy leagues. But I think the entire passing and rushing production pie for these offenses could grow more than anticipated and create multiple overachievers, because now the players are fluent in the offense. You have a lot of continuity in personnel in these offenses, and you can really start seeing why the Vikings hired Kevin O'Connell, why Doug Peterson has had such a track record of offensive success, why if Brian Daboll did that with the dollar store yard sale pieces he had last year, what can he do now that we talked about Darren Waller? So this is an angle I'm looking at as an edge, not the new offenses, because we could talk about Baltimore, we could talk about the Chargers, and then we need to and we should, but the second year offenses get overlooked.
Yeah, I think that's a great one. And I think that, like, if anything we saw last year, I think that we need to take a step back and try to identify offensive success more so than just identifying players. Because the guys, like last year, we saw Philadelphia, Jacksonville, Miami, everybody beat ADP when you identify these offenses. So I think that's a great way of looking at it. Sticking with these large-scale, high-stakes formats, FFPC, NFFC, these tournaments, like the football guys, like the Players' Championship at FFPC, people are constantly looking for correct correlation plays between quarterbacks and receivers, possibly stacks, but at least a little bit of correlation. You also obviously see it in underdog. Who do you think is a quarterback receiver combination that could really tilt leagues this year that's maybe not quite at the truly elite center? You referenced Daniel Jones, Darren Waller.
Yeah.
That's an interesting one.
Yeah, I'm going to kind of try to think on my feet on this one, because that was the first one that popped into my head, because we've already talked about them. I think that you can probably get a little cute with it too. Like, and what we're looking at here, I don't think you want to lock yourself into stacking that really puts a cramp in your draft plan, right? So I think you eliminate right off the bat stacks where you have to draft pieces or multiple pieces in the first 3 or 4 rounds. So using that as something to disqualify. I think Justin Fields and DJ Moore is really interesting. We're hearing a ton about the chemistry between the two of them. We're hearing a lot about Justin Fields taking a step forward as a passer. It's another year 2 offense. By the way, Luke Getsy, a little more of an unknown, but Justin Fields to DJ Moore, it seems like Justin Fields' passing success is going to be directly tied to DJ Moore's success in a fantasy sense. And if one hits, the other is going to hit. And again, Justin Fields hitting as a passer, because, hey, Justin Fields might just hit as a runner, and that could be enough. I think that you can probably get away with something like, and this is more super flex leagues and one quarterback league, something like Brock Purdy and Brandon Ayuk, right? Again, I think where you want to get that correlated success. And if I understand the theory correctly, and I might not, especially when you get in these big tournaments or you get to week 15, 16, 17, it's a way you can have a discrete edge and double your edge or amplify or magnify, multiply the edge by getting in to that very successful combination of players. As I kind of sift through these other things, Deshaun Watson, that's another quarterback name, by the way. Deshaun Watson and Elijah Moore, right?
I love that you say Elijah Moore and not Amari Cooper, because I've heard your takes on Elijah Moore. So talk about this one, Sig, and then talk about your thoughts on Moore, because I love seeing you on Moore.
Well, we're just hearing more that's been the guy in OTAs. Now, it's hard. You're getting conflicting reports about whether DeAndre Hopkins is still in play for Cleveland, but let's put that aside for now. Elijah Moore is a player that we were really excited to draft last year, and things went south quickly between him and the Jets. He asked for a trade, and he eventually got his trade. And this is a player that can work at all three levels of the field. This is a player that can really become the primary target in offense, and it sounds like he's already laying down the groundwork for that. And the other thing I'll mention always when I bring this up is when I think of Deshaun Watson, I think of Hunter Renfrow. And I think part of the reason that Deshaun Watson, when you think of Deshaun Watson, he's not like Josh Allen, right? Like, you don't think of Deshaun Watson making his mark in the NFL by these high degree of difficulty plays. He's an efficient quarterback. He is a quarterback that has clarity when he reads the field. He gets the ball quickly. And I think that target, that's the easiest target, is a guy that he's going to zero in on. And Amari Cooper, Donovan Peoples-Jones, these are going to be guys running more on the boundaries, maybe winning more contested balls and things like that. I think that Elijah Moore makes sense as the first read on these plays. And it's really just a question, because of that unknown, I think the uncertainty has pushed both of their ADPs down from previous levels when there's a lot of signs that they should be moving up.
Yeah, I love it. It's revenge of the Kadarius Toney and Elijah Moore drafters this year.
Yeah.
And they could both come back. I think that would be a great storyline. Want to stick with the AFC North, because you are a Pittsburgh Steelers fan and you talk about it, and you're passionate with your fanhood, Sig, and I think that's also great. But the AFC North seems like it could be a shootout division. Should we kind of dismiss our priors with AFC North? Are you buying into the changing of the AFC North and everybody becoming kind of Cincinnati light with Todd Monken and
right? Yeah, I mean, Todd Monken's interesting. The pace will improve, the aggressiveness, the downfield passing, the using Lamar Jackson as a pocket passer will improve. I think the Steelers are still going to be conservative. I think it's just not a lot has changed. I mean, the offensive line should get better. I still think they're going to be a running team. I still think they're going to be telling Kenny Pickett, just don't lose the game for us. Cleveland, that Deshaun Watson's not going to be as bad as he was last year. It's not a given that he's going to return to the level of play he's had before. Also, cold weather. Remember, the word was he did not want to go to a cold weather team, and that's why he did not originally pick. Cleveland wasn't considered a team that had a chance of getting him originally, and then money talks, and Deshaun Watson.
Money warms you up a little bit.
Yeah, so that affects Watson more later in the year. I'm not saying this is something that's determinative, but we'll see. I think that I think that Baltimore is a really exciting offense, and I think we already saw once Lamar Jackson kind of break fantasy football in 2019, and I think that it's in the range of outcomes in a new offense, paid, relaxed, ready to commit to the long-term future of the team. I'm more excited about Baltimore than I am about this division as a whole. And I do think that when you see these divisional games, they're more likely to turn into street fights than shootouts.
Okay, so pouring a little bit of cold water on my AFC North theory, but that's good. And I want to ask you one thing. Najee Harris, we saw the receiving drop last year significantly he was in the 70s as a rookie, drops to the 40s with no Big Ben. We're starting to see a little bit of Jaylen Warren steam, a lot of reports. Right. What do you prefer right now, Jaylen Warren at ADP or Najee Harris at ADP?
Oh, it's got to be Warren. And I just think that people need to accept this as a committee. Maybe it's a 60-40 committee. And if the Steelers are successful overall in offense, again, if they're functional, if they're a middle of the road offense and efficiency, Najee Harris can still be a single at ADP, but it's going to take massive overachieving by him or this offense for him to be a hit at ADP, whereas Warren is so much cheaper and the team loves Warren. So I think by many metrics, Warren was better than Harris last year. I think if you watch the games, it wasn't clear who's the first round pick and who's an undrafted free agent. And I think, Theo, that's skewing the perception of this backfield, but thankfully not for the Steelers coaches.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think Warren's super interesting. Are there any other handcuffs, or not necessarily even handcuffs? Maybe if we could take it a step back and not even call it handcuffs, backfields where we're not analyzing it correctly. Are there some great values of the perceived number 2 backs right now?
Yeah, or just the backfield as a whole, because I'm going to say the backfield as a whole for Seattle, right?
Yes.
If Najee Harris is worth a 3rd-round pick, then Kenneth Walker's worth a 3rd-round pick, right? And Zach Charbonnet is probably worth a 5th or a 6th-round pick. I think that we're looking at Seattle as an ascendant offense. Absolutely. You know, this is why can't they both hit? You know, you mentioned that Ingram Kamara backfield. Why can't they both hit? Why not? And in that same vein, Gibbs and Montgomery. I don't think Gibbs makes a lot of sense as a 4th-round pick. I think he's more of a 3rd-round pick. I don't think that Montgomery makes sense as a 7th-round pick. Montgomery at least starts out at the baseline of Jamal Williams. He was worth more than a 7th-round pick last year, I believe. I think if we go back and look at the numbers, why is Dave Montgomery, who has got a little more wiggle, is a little more talented, maybe a lot more talented than Jamal Williams, why is he going in the 7th round? And then if you're saying, well, you're concerned about Montgomery in any way whatsoever, then we need to talk about, I don't know, Mo Ibrahim or somebody, because it's this Detroit offense that's going to produce numbers by just showing up and executing. So I think looking at it as, yeah, you can take both backs in a backfield and they can both hit. That applies to Seattle and Detroit.
Yeah, I love that. And I think we talked about kind of getting rid of prior norms in fantasy football. And in the age of committee, you're better off betting on two running backs from the same backfield than trying to pick some bottom 5 offenses RB1 that you're not going to get impactful weeks from. I think that's like, if David Montgomery's in your flex all year long, that's not a bad thing. And right now he's very affordable and you're getting a piece of that offense. And, you know, if anything were to happen to Gibbs, Montgomery could end up being a league winner. So Sig, you've been extremely generous with your time. We're nearing an hour here. The title of our show is League Winners. So tell me a couple of guys that are going to be a big part of your draft plan that maybe you're a little bit ahead of consensus on, or guys you just have strong conviction on.
Yeah, I'm just going to talk about rookie running backs really quick. And I've mentioned a lot of these guys as we've gone through the show. Rookie running backs, and not the rookie running backs you're thinking, like Bijan Robinson, and Gibbs, who we talked about. I think Zach Charbonnet, Devin A-Chain, I know Dalvin Cook looms over that. And hey, if Dalvin Cook gets signed and it drops A-Chain's ADP, all the better. Even Tank Bigsby, I think, is someone that we should be thinking about later on in our drafts. I'd like Antonio Gibson. I think a new coach, some signs, new offensive coordinator, and some signs that he's going to be used a lot more efficiently, especially as a receiver. I'm interested in all those pieces of the Lions offense. Jameson Williams, the cheaper pieces, Jameson Williams, Sam Laporta. I mentioned Rashid Shaheed. I like Zay Flowers. I like Sky Moore. When we have uncertainty, I like taking players that are the cheapest of the bunch, right? Who's going to be the number 1 receiver who can stay healthy for the Ravens? Who's going to be the guy that really riffs with Patrick Mahomes? And I guess I'll just toss one more out there from an uncertain wide receiver situation. I really like Terrace Marshall. I think there's a lot of signs. I think one thing that people need to know when they're factoring in how to interpret the first 2 years of Terrace Marshall is that he and Matt Rule it didn't work. It didn't work. And voila, Matt Rule's fired, and Terrace Marshall starts to play, and Terrace Marshall starts to produce. And I think that while they brought in all these other guys, Terrace Marshall is still the most talented receiver on that roster.
I love that. Could it be DJ Shark situation where we see a guy that didn't do anything and then all of a sudden breaks out? I think that's two LSU guys. It could be a nice parallel, especially with the Thielens and the Sharks and the weapons that are the perceived ambiguity in that receiver core. I think that's great. I love those. And then you mentioned Kyle Pitts. You mentioned Darren Waller. Is there a later tight end that you're into right now, Sig?
Chiggy Okonkwo. I mean, if we're talking about later on, because what are we looking for potential league winners at tight end? It's the guy who could be the primary target for his team. And I know there's Traylon Burks and the Titans are in on DeAndre Hopkins, but Okonkwo is just one of those players that he made an earlier than expected impact, a bigger than expected impact. And I don't think we know his ceiling. That's what I love to draft, Theo. I love to draft players with unknown ceilings. And even though the Titans offense has a known and not that high ceiling, Okonkwo is a player that good things happen when they get the ball in his hands. So they should probably do that a lot more often this year.
Yeah, I agree with you. We're big on Chig Okonkwo at Player Profiler, and it's good to see you're on him as well. Sig, people are probably following you. Let everybody know where they can find your work and what you have coming out.
Yeah, football guys, if you don't know about football guys, I'm sure there's something there for you. And we just love it. We're of the community. We're just people from the community that enjoy swimming around in this stuff all the time. As far as what's coming up, we've got Cecil and I on the Audible. Get where you get your podcast. Our preseason watch list is about to roll out. We do an episode for every team. We go all the way down the depth chart. We love talking about the most obscure players. And it's just that reset. It's an exercise for us that we do a reset. Where are we on all of these teams, all these players? What are we thinking about? What are the questions going into the training camp? It gets you ready for the fire hose of news and how to sort through it, like we talked about earlier in the show, and get ready for drafting season. And then next thing you know, it's football season.
Yeah, and I'll give football guys a shout out because we just dropped our world famous draft kit, and I had Dave Kluge and Troy King, and we had Jordan McNamara all do fantastic cameos. If you want to buy it, you can get the all-in package right now. Use the code Theo for $10 off. Sig, you were awesome. It was a really, really, really great discussing stuff with you. Tune in tomorrow, everyone. I have Andrew Erickson on with Billy Muzio and I at 3:30 in the afternoon for First Class Fantasy, and we'll have another press coverage next week. I appreciate all the warm messages about getting this podcast going, and looking forward to bringing you some great guests. But it's gonna be hard to top Sigmund Bloom today. You were just awesome, man. So everybody have a great rest of their day, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Hey, I want to take a moment to thank you for tuning in. It's important to me that all of our media be free. This is only possible because of you allowing a true independent sports media enterprise to thrive unlike any other in the business. So please subscribe to the All-In Package to continue to make all of this possible, to ensure that all of our stats, information, data, content is available to you, especially you, the people that get the site and get the show.